hunger that walks, a Wendigo chronicle in the deepest reaches of the northern wilderness, where winter reigns supreme for 8 months of the year, and the forests stretch endlessly beneath skies that shimmer with aurora light. There exists a legend so terrifying that even now, in an age of science and skepticism, the indigenous peoples who have lived in these lands for countless generations refuse to speak its name after darkness falls. It is a legend born from the harshest realities of survival, from the desperate extremities to which human beings can be driven when confronted with starvation and cold, and the absolute isolation of the frozen north. It is the legend of the Wendigo, and it speaks to something primal and horrible that lurks not only in the shadowed spaces between the trees, but within the human heart itself. The Wendigo is not merely a monster in the way that other creatures of folklore and mythology are monsters. It is not simply a predator that hunts in the night, not just another danger to be avoided in a landscape already filled with natural perils. The Wendigo represents something far more profound and far more disturbing than simple physical threat. It embodies transformation, the terrible metamorphosis that occurs when a human being crosses certain boundaries that should never be crossed, when survival instinct overcomes humanity itself, when hunger becomes so overwhelming that it consumes not just the body, but the soul. The Wendigo is what happens when a person eats the flesh of another person, when cannibalism transforms the cannibal into something that is no longer human, something that can never again be human, something that exists in an eternal state of craving that can never be satisfied. The origins of the Wendigo legend are lost in the mists of time, predating written history, passed down through generations of Algonquian-speaking peoples across the vast northern territories of what would eventually be called Canada and the northern United States. The Cree, the Ojibwe, the Innu, the Naskapi, and many other nations each possessed their own variations of the story, their own specific details and warnings. But the core remained consistent across cultures and across centuries. There was a taboo, the most fundamental taboo, against consuming human flesh. And there was a consequence for breaking that taboo, a consequence more terrible than death, more horrible than any mere physical punishment. The consequence was transformation into a Wendigo. The physical descriptions of the Wendigo vary depending on which tradition one consults, which storyteller one hears the tale from, but certain characteristics remain constant. It is always described as impossibly tall, towering over the tallest trees, a giant that moves through the forest with unnatural silence despite its size. Some say it stands 15 feet high, others claim 20 or even 30 feet, a creature whose very dimensions defy natural law. Its body is emaciated to the point of being skeletal, skin pulled tight over bones, every rib visible, every joint protruding. A walking corpse that somehow continues to move and hunt and feed despite appearing to be nothing but animated death. The skin itself is described variously as gray as ash, pale as snow, or with a sickly yellowish cast like old parchment, stretched so thin across the underlying bone structure that it seems translucent, as if the creature is barely substantial, caught between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The face of the Wendigo is perhaps its most horrifying feature. The eyes are often described as sunken deep into the skull, glowing with a faint luminescence like embers in the darkness, or sometimes as empty sockets that somehow still track prey through the winter forest. The nose is reduced to a skeletal ridge or missing entirely, leaving only gaping holes in the center of the face. The mouth is the most terrible feature of all, a gash that extends far too wide, filled with broken, yellowed teeth that are too sharp, too numerous, too wrong. Some accounts speak of lips that have been chewed away, as if the Wendigo has been gnawing on its own face in its endless hunger. Others describe a mouth that can unhinge like a serpent's, opening impossibly wide to consume its prey in great, tearing bites. The hands of the Wendigo are similarly disturbing, fingers elongated into talons, nails grown into claws that can rend flesh and crack bone, hands that were once human but have been stretched and twisted and sharpened into instruments of predation. The creature's limbs are too long, arms that reach nearly to the ground when it walks upright, legs that allow it to cover vast distances with each stride, joints that bend in ways that human joints should not bend. Some traditions speak of the Wendigo having antlers or horns like a great stag, a crown of bone that sprouts from its skull, further marking its transformation from human to monster, from natural to supernatural. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Wendigo's physical form, the detail that appears again and again in accounts across different cultures and different time periods, is that no matter how much it eats, it never becomes satiated. In fact, the opposite occurs. The more the Wendigo consumes, the hungrier it becomes, and as its hunger grows, so does its body. Each meal makes it larger, more gaunt, more desperate. Its stomach, though it may be filled with the flesh of its victims, never provides nourishment, never brings satisfaction. The Wendigo is locked in a cycle of eternal starvation, forever eating, forever growing, forever craving, forever suffering. It is punishment and transformation combined, a curse that ensures the cannibal will experience for eternity the very hunger that drove them to their original sin. The transformation into a Wendigo can occur in different ways according to the various traditions, though certain triggers appear consistently across the legends. The most common origin is through the act of cannibalism itself. When a person, driven by starvation during a harsh winter, when game has disappeared and supplies have been exhausted, when death by hunger seems certain, makes the choice to consume the flesh of another human being, the transformation begins. It might not happen immediately. The person might believe they have escaped consequences, that they have survived through their terrible choice, that they can return to normal life and forget what they did in those desperate days. But the change has already started, working from within, corrupting the soul before it corrupts the body. The first signs are subtle. The person who has eaten human flesh finds that normal food no longer satisfies them. They can eat and eat, consuming vast quantities of fish or game or any other sustenance, but they remain hungry. The hunger grows, becoming an obsession, a constant gnawing emptiness that dominates every thought. They begin to lose weight despite eating, their body consuming itself even as they consume everything they can find. Their behavior becomes erratic, antisocial. They withdraw from their community, spending more and more time alone, venturing into the forest at odd hours, returning with strange looks in their eyes and blood on their clothes they cannot explain. As the transformation progresses, the physical changes become apparent. The person grows taller, their frame stretching unnaturally, bones lengthening in ways that cause terrible pain. Their skin takes on that characteristic ashen pallor, becoming cold to the touch, losing its elasticity and warmth. Their teeth begin to shift and sharpen, their nails hardening into claws. They lose the ability to feel warmth, experiencing the world as endlessly, bitterly cold, no matter how close they stand to a fire, no matter how many layers they wear. This unrelenting cold is part of the curse, a reflection of the frozen heart that now beats within their chest, a heart that has abandoned compassion and humanity and knows only hunger and cold and the driving need to feed. The final stage of transformation occurs when the person fully becomes the Wendigo, when the last vestiges of their humanity are stripped away, and they stand revealed as the monster they have become. This moment is often described as occurring during a moment of supreme anguish, when the transforming individual recognizes what they are becoming, but finds themselves unable to stop it, unable to turn back. They flee into the forest, driven by instinct to escape human contact, to find solitude in which to complete their terrible metamorphosis. They run through the snow-covered wilderness, their body changing with each stride, growing, elongating, becoming less and less human with every moment. Behind them, they might hear the voices of loved ones calling them back, begging them to stop, to fight the change. But these voices grow fainter as the Wendigo spirit takes full possession. By the time they finally stop running, they have traveled miles into the deepest wilderness, and the person they once were has ceased to exist. Once fully transformed, the Wendigo becomes a hunter, a stalker of the winter forest, driven entirely by its insatiable hunger. It moves through the snow without leaving tracks, or in some versions, leaves tracks of impossible size that terrify those who find them. It can move with supernatural speed when pursuing prey, covering distances in moments that would take a human hours to traverse. Despite its enormous size, it makes almost no sound when it wishes to remain undetected, able to approach within feet of a victim without alerting them to its presence. Only when it chooses to announce itself does it make noise, and that noise is perhaps the most terrifying thing about the Wendigo. The cry of the Wendigo is something that, once heard, can never be forgotten by those fortunate enough to survive the encounter. It is described as starting low, a sound like wind moving through dead trees, a hollow moaning that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then it rises, climbing in pitch and intensity, becoming a shriek that pierces the night, a sound of such profound hunger and despair and malevolence that it freezes the blood of anyone who hears it. The cry echoes through the forest, distorted by distance and cold, seeming to come from multiple directions simultaneously, making it impossible to determine where the creature actually is. Within that cry, some say they can hear words, or what might once have been words, the remnants of human speech twisted into something incomprehensible and horrible. The Wendigo trying and failing to form the language it once spoke, managing only sounds that parody human communication. The hunting patterns of the Wendigo reflect its origins in human cannibalism. It does not prey on animals, shows no interest in the deer or moose or caribou that share its forest domain. It hunts only humans, specifically seeking out people who are isolated, vulnerable, separated from the safety of their communities. It has a particular preference for hunting during the depths of winter, during blizzards and periods of extreme cold, when travelers might become lost, or when small groups might find themselves trapped by weather, supplies running low, desperation setting in. The Wendigo can sense this desperation, can smell fear and hunger from miles away, drawn to those who are experiencing the same extremity that created it in the first place. When the Wendigo hunts, it employs tactics that are disturbingly intelligent, reflecting the human mind that still exists somewhere within the monster. It will stalk a victim for days, appearing at the edge of vision, and then vanishing, leaving signs of its presence calculated to inspire terror. Massive prints in the snow that suddenly appear and then end without explanation. Trees that have been clawed to pieces, the marks too high and too deep to be from any natural animal. The sound of something large moving parallel to a traveler's path, packing them through the forest, never quite visible, but always present. The Wendigo is playing with its prey, savoring the fear, drawn not just to the flesh, but to the psychological torment it can inflict. In some accounts, the Wendigo possesses the ability to mimic voices, calling out in the tones of a lost loved one, luring its victims away from safety with the promise of rescue or reunion. A man traveling through a blizzard might hear his wife calling his name, sounding desperate and close, and he will follow that voice deeper into the storm, deeper into the wilderness, never catching up to the source of the call, until suddenly it is behind him, and he turns to see not his wife, but the towering, skeletal horror of the Wendigo looming over him, its mouth already opening impossibly wide. By the time he understands the deception, it is far too late to run, far too late to save himself. The Wendigo's method of killing its prey varies in the accounts, but it is universally described as savage and efficient. Some stories tell of the creature using its massive claws to tear victims apart, rendering flesh from bone with single swipes of its elongated hands. Others speak of it crushing its prey in its jaws, those terrible broken teeth puncturing and tearing until nothing recognizable remains. Still others describe a more disturbing method, where the Wendigo consumes its victim whole, swallowing them alive into a stomach that is somehow both impossibly large and eternally empty, the victim dying in absolute darkness, aware that they are being digested, but unable to escape. Their final moments spent in the belly of a monster that was once, perhaps, human like themselves. After feeding, the Wendigo does not retreat to rest or digest its meal. Instead, its hunger intensifies. The curse that drives it ensures that consumption brings no satisfaction, only increased craving. Within hours of feeding, it is hunting again, stalking through the winter forest with renewed desperation, its cry echoing even more plaintively, the sound of a soul in absolute torment, unable to satisfy the need that consumes it. Each victim only makes the hunger worse, only increases the Wendigo's size and its suffering, creating a terrible cycle that can never end as long as the creature exists. The indigenous peoples who lived with the constant threat of the Wendigo developed extensive knowledge of how to protect against it, and, if necessary, how to destroy it. Prevention was always preferable to confrontation, and so communities established strict taboos and protocols designed to ensure that the circumstances that created Wendigos would not arise. Food was shared communally during harsh winters, ensuring that no one family would face starvation alone and potentially be driven to cannibalism. Hunters who went out alone were required to return within specific timeframes, with search parties sent if they were overdue, preventing isolation that might lead to transformation. Stories of the Wendigo were told regularly, especially to young people, impressing upon them the absolute prohibition against consuming human flesh under any circumstances whatsoever, making it clear that no extremity of hunger justified breaking this taboo. If someone was suspected of being in the early stages of Wendigo transformation, exhibiting the warning signs of increased hunger, antisocial behavior, and the beginning of physical changes, the community would take immediate action. Shamans, or spiritual leaders, would perform ceremonies intended to drive out the Wendigo spirit before it could fully take hold, using sacred smoke, chanting, and symbolic rituals that called upon protective spirits to intervene. The afflicted person would be watched constantly, prevented from isolating themselves, fed specially prepared foods thought to combat the supernatural hunger. In many cases, these interventions were successful, the transformation arrested before it reached the point of no return, the person restored to their humanity and reintegrated into the community, though they would bear the stigma of having come so close to becoming a monster for the rest of their lives. But if the transformation had progressed too far, if the person had fully become a Wendigo, or was so far along that restoration was impossible, more extreme measures were necessary. The Wendigo had to be hunted and destroyed, not just for the safety of the community, but as an act of mercy for the cursed individual trapped within the monster. Killing a Wendigo was considered one of the most dangerous and sacred tasks a warrior could undertake, requiring not just physical courage, but spiritual preparation and protection. The methods for killing a Wendigo are specific and crucial. Ordinary weapons are generally ineffective, or at least insufficient on their own. Arrows and spears might wound the creature, but will not stop it. And an injured Wendigo is even more dangerous than an uninjured one, its rage and hunger intensified by pain. The most reliable method, repeated across numerous traditions, is fire. The Wendigo must be burned completely, reduced to ash, every trace of its physical form destroyed. But even this is not simple, as the Wendigo's association with cold and ice makes it resistant to fire. The flames struggling to catch on its frozen flesh, burning only slowly and with great difficulty. Some traditions speak of the need for silver weapons, bullets or blades made from this metal possessing special efficacy against the Wendigo, as against other supernatural creatures. Others mention the importance of striking the heart specifically, that organ which has become frozen and dark being the seat of the Wendigo curse, destruction of the heart being necessary to end the creature's existence. Still others speak of the necessity of dismembering the Wendigo entirely, separating the parts of its body and burning them individually in different locations to prevent any possibility of regeneration or return. The spiritual dimension of hunting a Wendigo is at least as important as the physical. Those who undertake this task must be spiritually pure, must have undergone cleansing rituals, and received blessings from shamans or spiritual leaders. They must carry protective talismans, objects imbued with spiritual power that can ward off the Wendigo's influence and prevent it from using its supernatural abilities against them. During the hunt, they must maintain constant vigilance, not just for physical attack, but for psychological assault, as the Wendigo will attempt to inspire terror, to make hunters hear things that are not there, see things in the shadows that might be the creature or might be illusion, and above all, to divide the hunting party, to separate individuals from the group, where they can be picked off one by one. Encounters with Wendigos, as reported in the oral histories and later written accounts of northern communities, follow certain recognizable patterns. A typical account might begin with a hunter or trapper who has gone into the deep wilderness alone, perhaps tracking game or checking traplines in a remote area. The weather turns suddenly severe, a blizzard moving in with unexpected speed, visibility dropping to nothing, temperature plummeting. The hunter seeks shelter, finding a cave or constructing a hasty windbreak, preparing to wait out the storm. As night falls and the wind howls around their shelter, they become aware of another sound beneath the wind, a low moaning that seems to move around their position. tell themselves it is just the wind, just the storm, but the sound persists, growing closer, and with it comes a smell, a scent of corruption and decay that should not exist in the clean freeze of the northern winter. The hunter lights a fire, building it as large as they can, knowing that fire is protection, that most natural predators will avoid flame. But the presence outside their shelter does not retreat. In fact, it seems drawn to the light, moving closer, and now the hunter can see shapes in the darkness beyond the firelight, something impossibly tall, moving in ways that no natural creature moves, all wrong angles and jerking motion like a puppet with tangled strings. The moaning has developed into something like words, syllables that almost make sense, but are too distorted to understand. And underlying it is another sound, a grinding, gnashing sound of teeth meeting and parting, meeting and parting, the sound of eternal hunger. If the hunter is wise and lucky and blessed, they survive until morning by feeding their fire constantly, never allowing it to diminish, perhaps firing rifle shots into the darkness when the shape comes too close, not hopping to kill it, but hopping to drive it back temporarily. When dawn finally comes and the storm clears, the hunter emerges to find the area around their shelter completely disturbed. Massive prints in the snow circling their position again and again. Trees nearby shredded as if by enormous claws. And perhaps worst of all, a complete absence of any normal animal tracks. Everything natural has fled the area, leaving only the signs of the unnatural thing that stalked through the night. The hunter returns to their community as quickly as possible and reports what they encountered. And the elders nod grimly and increase security, and warn everyone to travel in groups and to carry protective talismans, because a Wendigo is hunting, and until it is found and destroyed, no one is safe. But not all encounters end with the witness surviving to tell the tale. The forests of the north have claimed countless individuals over the centuries, hunters and trappers who went into the wilderness and simply never returned, search parties finding no trace of them, or finding only disturbing evidence, a campsite destroyed with signs of massive struggle, belongings scattered and bloodstained, tracks leading away into the deepest forest, tracks that no natural animal could have made. Some of these disappearances are surely due to natural causes, to the very real dangers of traveling in harsh wilderness, where cold and predators and simple accident can kill. But the people who live in these regions know that not all disappearances have natural explanations, that some of those who vanish have encountered something worse than wolves or bears or blizzards, have met the Wendigo and been consumed by it, adding to its ever-growing hunger. The psychological impact of the Wendigo, legend on the communities that believed in it, cannot be overstated. The creature represented not just a physical threat, but a spiritual and moral one, a constant reminder of the boundaries that must not be crossed, the taboos that must not be broken. In a harsh environment where survival often hung by a thread, where harsh winters could and did result in starvation, where the temptation to resort to cannibalism in extremis was not theoretical, but real. The Wendigo served as a powerful deterrent. It said that some things are worse than death, that survival at the cost of one's humanity is no survival at all, that it is better to die human than to live as a monster. The legend also reflected the genuine psychological phenomenon that became known in anthropological literature as Wendigo psychosis, a culture-bound syndrome reported primarily among Algonquian peoples, in which individuals would become obsessed with the fear of becoming a Wendigo or with cannibalistic thoughts. Sufferers of this condition would experience intense anxiety, paranoia, and an overwhelming dread that they were transforming into the creature. They would report feeling the characteristic hunger, the cold, the physical changes. In some cases, they would become violent, perceiving themselves as already transformed and acting accordingly. Communities took these cases very seriously, sometimes resulting in the execution of the afflicted individual as a preventive measure, treating them as a Wendigo in the early stages of transformation that had to be stopped before they could harm others. Modern scholars debate the precise nature and prevalence of Wendigo psychosis, with some arguing it was overreported or misunderstood by European observers who did not fully grasp the cultural context, while others point to documented cases that seem to clearly demonstrate the syndrome. What is undeniable is that the Wendigo was real to the people who believed in it, real enough to shape behavior, to influence social structures, to inspire genuine terror and genuine precautions. Whether the physical creature ever existed is perhaps less important than the fact that the psychological and cultural impact of the belief was absolutely real and absolutely powerful. As European colonization brought new peoples into the northern territories, encounters with Wendigo legends and reports of Wendigo sightings became part of the documented historical record. Traders, missionaries, and settlers heard the stories from indigenous peoples and sometimes reported their own encounters or heard accounts from other Europeans who claimed to have seen something in the wilderness that defied explanation. These reports were typically met with skepticism by the broader society, dismissed as superstition or misidentification of natural phenomena. A moose seen at night, moving through trees, its size and shape distorted by shadow and fear, might become a Wendigo in the telling. The cry of a lynx or wolf, echoing strangely through frozen air, might be interpreted as the creature's hunting call. Yet some accounts are less easily dismissed, reported by multiple witnesses or by individuals whose credibility was well established. Describing encounters with something that does not fit comfortably into categories of known wildlife or natural phenomena. A trading party traveling through Saskatchewan in the 1870s reported being stalked for 3 days by something that left tracks nearly 2 feet long, that they glimpsed only in fragments through the trees, always at a distance, impossibly tall and impossibly thin, moving through deep snow without apparent effort while the traders struggled through drifts. They reported hearing it at night, a sound like human screaming mixed with animal howling, and smelling something rotting despite the freezing temperatures. On the third night, one member of the party fired his rifle at a shape that had approached too close to their camp, and they heard a shriek that sent them all running for their sleds despite the darkness and danger. They traveled through the night and did not stop until they reached a settlement 2 days later. None of them ever returned to that region. In the early 20th century, as logging operations pushed deeper into previously untouched wilderness, there were periodic reports from logging camps of encounters with something in the deep forest, something that would steal supplies, would be heard moving around camps at night, would leave signs of its presence that frightened the loggers enough that some camps were abandoned not for economic reasons, but because the men refused to work in areas where they believed a Wendigo was present. Logging company records rarely documented these reasons officially, instead citing vague operational difficulties. But letters and journals from the period tell a different story of hardened woodsmen who had lived and worked in the wilderness their entire lives, becoming genuinely afraid of something they encountered in certain locations. The Wendigo also made its way into popular culture during the 20th century, becoming a staple of horror fiction and later appearing in films, television shows, and video games. These popular depictions often strayed far from the original legends, sometimes depicting the Wendigo as little more than a savage beast, losing the crucial element of the human-to-monster transformation and the psychological horror that accompanies it. Some versions turned it into something like a zombie or feral human, emphasizing the cannibalism, but losing the supernatural elements. Others went in the opposite direction, making it a nearly godlike entity with vast powers that bore little resemblance to the original conception. A few more thoughtful treatments have attempted to preserve the core of the legend while adapting it for modern audiences. These versions emphasize the tragedy of the Wendigo, the fact that it is not simply a monster to be feared, but a cursed human being worthy of pity even as it must be destroyed. They explore the psychological horror of feeling oneself losing humanity, of knowing one is becoming something monstrous, but being unable to stop the transformation. They use the Wendigo as a metaphor for various forms of destructive hunger that exist in modern life, for addictions and obsessions that consume the person afflicted with them while never providing true satisfaction, for greed and exploitation that grow more extreme with each indulgence. In these interpretations, the Wendigo becomes relevant to contemporary audiences, not as a literal creature to fear, but as a symbol of the dangers of allowing appetite to override ethics, of what happens when humans lose connection with their humanity in pursuit of satisfaction that can never truly come. The environmental context of the Wendigo legend also deserves attention, as the creature is inextricably linked to the harsh northern landscape that formed the backdrop for the cultures that created it. The endless forests of spruce and pine, the frozen lakes and rivers, the long winter nights when temperatures plunge far below zero, and the world becomes a monochrome landscape of white snow and black trees and gray sky. This environment shapes the legend as surely as the legend reflects the environment. The Wendigo is a creature of winter, of cold, of the hardship and isolation that winter brings. It does not exist in temperate climates or tropical regions, is never reported in spring or summer. It is intrinsically tied to the experience of surviving in one of the harshest inhabited environments on Earth, where nature itself seems hostile to human life, where one wrong decision or one piece of bad luck can mean death. In this landscape, the line between survival and doom is razor thin. Travelers can become disoriented in blizzards and freeze to death within sight of safety. Game animals can disappear, their migration patterns disrupted by weather or other factors, leaving communities facing starvation. Ice that seems solid can give way without warning, plunging a person into water so cold that survival time is measured in minutes. In such an environment, where death lurks constantly just beyond the fire's light, where the consequences of error are immediate and absolute, it is perhaps natural that the people who lived there would develop legends of monsters that embodied the worst possibilities of this harsh world. The Wendigo represents the ultimate failure of humanity to maintain itself in the face of nature's extremity. It is what happens when the careful balance between humans and environment collapses, when someone is pushed past the breaking point and makes the choice that can never be unmade. In this sense, the Wendigo is both monster and cautionary tale, both genuine threat and teaching tool. By emphasizing the terrible consequences of cannibalism, the legend helped ensure that communities would do everything possible to prevent circumstances where such an act might be contemplated, would maintain social structures of food sharing and mutual support that increased everyone's chances of survival. Modern sightings of Wendigos continue to be reported, though with much less frequency, and in a context where belief in the literal existence of the creature is much less widespread. These contemporary reports typically come from hunters, hikers, or others spending time in remote wilderness areas, individuals who encounter something they cannot explain, and reaching for a framework to understand their experience, apply the Wendigo legend. They report finding massive tracks, hearing strange cries in the night, seeing something moving through the trees that was too large and too wrongly proportioned to be any known animal. Most of these reports are probably misidentifications, natural phenomena misinterpreted through the lens of fear and expectation. But the fact that people continue to make these reports, continue to apply the Wendigo framework to their unexplained experiences, suggests that the legend retains psychological power, even in an age that has largely moved away from belief in such creatures. There is also the question of whether the Wendigo legend reflects some deeper truth about human nature and psychology that transcends the specific cultural context in which it arose. The concept of an insatiable hunger that grows with feeding, of appetite that can never be satisfied no matter how much it consumes, resonates across cultures and time periods. It appears in various forms in Greek myths, in Buddhist teachings, in Christian theology, in modern discussions of addiction and compulsive behavior. The Wendigo gives physical form to a psychological reality. The fact that some forms of craving actually intensify when indulged rather than being satisfied. The person who becomes obsessed with wealth finds that each milestone of accumulation only moves the goalpost further, that the million they thought would be enough must become 10 million, then 100 million, the hunger growing with each acquisition. The addict finds that each use requires more of the substance to achieve the same effect, the body and mind adapting to require ever-increasing doses, the appetite expanding to match and exceed availability. In this metaphorical reading, the Wendigo's physical transformation parallels the psychological and sometimes physical transformation of the person consumed by destructive appetite. They become hollow, their essential humanity eroded away, everything else in their life sacrificed to feed the hunger. They grow in superficial ways, accumulating possessions or achievements, but these accretions are not genuine growth, are not nourishment, are merely the expanding of an empty shell. They become isolated, driving away others with their single-minded focus on satisfying their craving, unable to maintain normal human relationships when every interaction becomes instrumental, evaluated only in terms of whether it serves the hunger. They become cold, losing the capacity for genuine warmth or connection, their emotional range narrowing, until all that remains is the desperate need for whatever it is they crave. In these ways, people can become Wendigos without literally transforming into the physical monster, becoming hollow, hungry creatures that retain human form, but have lost human essence. The remedy for such metaphorical Wendigo transformation mirrors in some ways the traditional methods for dealing with the literal creature. The process must be interrupted before it reaches the point of no return, intervention occurring while the person still retains enough humanity to be reached. The hunger must be starved rather than fed. The cycle of craving and indulgence broken through abstinence, and the reconstruction of life around values other than appetite satisfaction. The person must be reintegrated into community. Their isolation ended, human connection reestablished to provide meaning and purpose beyond the satisfaction of individual craving. And there must be, in a sense, a burning away of the old self, a destruction of the patterns and behaviors and self-concept that maintained the destructive cycle, a death and rebirth into a healthier way of being. For those who have progressed too far, who have become so consumed by their destructive hunger that they cannot be reached or helped, the traditional response was removal from the community, either through banishment or execution. Modern society handles such cases differently, but sometimes arrives at similar functional outcomes. The addict who cannot or will not stop using may be incarcerated when their behavior becomes criminal, effectively banished from society, even if technically remaining within its geographical boundaries. The person whose greed leads them to harm others may be imprisoned or ruined financially. The abuser may be restrained by court order or imprisonment from access to potential victims. These are, in their way, modern equivalents of the hunting and killing of the Wendigo. Society's attempt to protect itself from those who have become too consumed by destructive hunger to be safely included in the community. The Wendigo legend also raises profound questions about the nature of evil and moral responsibility. Is the Wendigo evil, or is it a victim of circumstances and curse? The person who first consumed human flesh may have done so under conditions of absolute desperation, may have been dying of starvation with no other option available, may have made the choice in extremis when rational thought was barely possible. Does such a person deserve the terrible punishment of eternal hunger and transformation into a monster? Yet the counterargument is that there is always a choice, that to survive through cannibalism is to choose to survive at the cost of one's humanity, and that some things should not be done even to preserve one's life. The Wendigo represents the consequences of that choice, the price paid for crossing a boundary that should be inviolable. Once transformed, is the Wendigo responsible for its actions? It kills and consumes humans not out of malice, but out of hunger, driven by a curse it did not ask for and cannot escape. Yet it remains dangerous, each victim genuinely suffering and dying, and so it must be destroyed regardless of whether we judge it morally culpable for its actions. The legend, thus, exists in a space of moral ambiguity, the creature simultaneously pitiable and horrifying, victim and monster, deserving of mercy and requiring destruction. This ambiguity makes it a richer and more psychologically complex creation than a simple monster story would suggest. The fact that the Wendigo was once human, that it retains some degree of human consciousness trapped within its monstrous form, adds another layer of horror to the legend. Some traditions hold that the Wendigo remembers its former life, knows who it once was, can recognize people it once knew and loved, but is powerless to resist the hunger that drives it to hunt and kill them. In this reading, the Wendigo's existence is one of absolute torment, forced to watch itself commit atrocities against those it cares about, unable to stop, unable to die, trapped in an eternity of unwilling evil. The cry of the Wendigo, that terrible sound that echoes through the winter forest, might be understood not just as the hunting call of a predator, but as the scream of a human soul in torment, begging for the release that will never come, mourning the humanity it has lost and the monster it has become. This interpretation transforms the Wendigo from a simple horror story into something approaching tragedy, the fall of a human being who made one terrible choice or faced one unbearable circumstance and paid a price completely disproportionate to any crime. It makes the necessary killing of the Wendigo not a triumph, but an act of mercy, putting to rest a suffering soul that cannot save itself. Those who hunt the Wendigo in this understanding do so not with hatred, or even with the satisfaction of protecting their community from a threat, but with sorrow for the necessity of the act, and with prayers for the peace of the spirit they release from its cursed existence. The Wendigo legend persists into the present day, kept alive by the communities that originated it, and now also by popular culture's endless fascination with horror and monsters. New generations hear the stories, learn the warnings, absorb the lessons embedded in the legend. In an age where the likelihood of facing starvation-driven cannibalism is much reduced for most people, the Wendigo might seem like a quaint relic of a harder time, a monster that has lost its relevance. But the deeper truths the legend speaks to remain as relevant as ever. The warning against allowing appetite to override ethics, against letting hunger of any kind consume one's humanity, against crossing boundaries that should remain inviolate. These lessons transcend their specific origin context and speak to fundamental aspects of human nature and human society. The northern forests still stretch vast and largely untouched, wild places where humans are visitors rather than masters, where the rules of civilization give way to older laws of survival and predation. On winter nights, when the temperature plunges and the aurora dances overhead, and the wind howls through the trees with a sound that is almost, but not quite like screaming, it is not difficult to imagine that something else is out there, something tall and terrible and eternally hungry, stalking through the darkness on its long legs, its glowing eyes scanning for prey, its mouth of broken teeth opening in a cry that freezes the soul. Whether that something is literally real or exists only in imagination and cultural memory might matter less than the fact that the possibility itself shapes behavior, inspires caution, reminds people of their humanity and the terrible ease with which it can be lost. The Wendigo endures as one of the most terrifying creatures in the folklore of North America, a monster that is more than a monster, a legend that functions as warning and wisdom and psychological insight. It speaks to fears that are both culturally specific and humanly universal, to the dangers of extreme environments and the dangers of extreme appetites, to what can happen to people when pushed too far, and what can happen when people push themselves beyond the boundaries of the permissible. In its emaciated, towering form, it embodies the paradox of destructive hunger, the truth that some appetites grow larger with each feeding, that satisfaction of certain cravings is not actually possible, no matter how much is consumed, and in its origin as a human being transformed by a terrible choice or unbearable circumstance, it reminds us how thin the line can be between humanity and monstrosity. how under the right or wrong conditions, any person might find themselves crossing boundaries they never imagined crossing, becoming something they never imagined they could become. The Wendigo waits in the winter forest, patient as only the eternal can be patient, hungry as only the cursed can be hungry, a monument to all who have lost their humanity, and a warning to all who might lose theirs, stalking through the darkness with its terrible cry echoing between the trees. Forever eating, forever growing, forever suffering the consequences of one unforgivable act, one broken taboo, one moment when survival was chosen over soul. And the legend remains, passed down through generations, told in different ways, but always with the same core message. There are boundaries that must not be crossed, prices that are too high to pay even for survival itself, transformations that once begun cannot be undone. The Wendigo is the embodiment of that message, living proof of what awaits those who forget their humanity in pursuit of satisfaction that can never come. And so the stories continue, and the warnings are repeated. And on cold winter nights in the North Country, people still lock their doors and feed their fires and listen carefully to the wind, just in case.